Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a monumental figure, dump their entire body of work on the table, and figure out exactly why they still matter to us right now. Today, we're not just diving into a single thinker. We are really diving into the foundation of Western thought itself. We're talking about Plato.
It's almost impossible to overstate that. I mean, when we talk about foundational thinkers, the most famous line has to come from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. He said that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato.
A series of footnotes. That's an extraordinary statement. It suggests that what every major philosophical question, every school of thought that came after, from theology to physics, is basically just responding to something this one guy laid out over 2,000 years ago.
Precisely. And that's our mission today, really, to unpack that dizzying claim. We've got sources on his life, his radical concepts like the theory of forms, his vision for the ideal state, and of course, the remarkable story of how his complete works even survived. We want to get at not just what he wrote, but why his ideas became this, this enduring intellectual blueprint for everything that followed.
Okay, so let's unpack this with some context. The man himself, we all know him as Plato, but we should start with his birth name, Aristocles, his best reputation. That says a lot about his family's ambitions for him, doesn't it?
It really does. And the name Plato itself, as you mentioned, is thought to be a nickname. It's often linked to his physical build. Some sources say it means broad or robust. It's pretty amazing that the name of maybe the greatest intellectual in history might actually just refer to him being, a sturdy guy.
I love that. So the sources confirm he was born into an extremely elite, politically connected Athenian family, somewhere between 428 and 423 BC. And this wasn't just new money. His lineage was historic. Through his mother, he was a descendant of Solon, the great lawgiver who basically set up Athenian democracy.
And that background is absolutely critical to understanding him. He wasn't born into this abstract world of philosophy. He was groomed for a life in politics. His family was entrenched in the aristocracy. I mean, the sources even confirm his brothers, Glaucon and Adimantus, were prominent enough that Plato gives them major roles in the Republic.
So his path was definitely not what we'd call academia. Before he was thinking about forms and ideal states, he was deep in the arts. Ancient biographers all seem to agree that poetry was his first love. He wrote dithyrambs, lyric poems, even tragedies, a whole tetralogy, in fact.
But then you get this incredibly dramatic turning point. The story goes that when he met Socrates, he had this profound realization about, the inadequacy of art, and he just abandoned it. He symbolically burned his poems. That break is everything. It signals the absolute centrality of Socrates' challenge to Plato's entire worldview. The pursuit of, fleeting beauty was just dropped for the pursuit of eternal truth.
Okay, so let's turn to that, part one. The crisis and formation of his thought. And that has to start with the single most pivotal relationship in his life, his devotion to Socrates. Plato was one of these devoted young men who would just follow Socrates around the marketplace, absorbing this unique way of thinking.
Well, Socrates represents a complete shift in Greek thought. I mean, before him, you had natural philosophy. People were trying to figure out what the universe was made of. Socrates just changed the entire agenda. He moved the investigation from the stars and the elements to ethics and politics, to the question of how you ought to live.
And he did that with the Socratic method, right? That relentless questioning, that cross-examination to expose contradictions and ignorance in what people thought they knew.
Exactly. And that method underpins all of Plato's early work. It's why Socrates appears in, almost every single one of Plato's dialogues, except for the laws. But this creates one of the biggest challenges in all of classical scholarship, the Socratic problem.
Right. Because Plato never speaks in his own voice. He's always using Socrates as his mouthpiece. So the big question is, how much of this is the historical Socrates? And how much is just Plato using his revered teacher as, a megaphone for his own much more developed ideas?
It's a crucial distinction. We actually have some help here from Plato's own student, Aristotle. He helps us sort of separate the two. Aristotle suggests that for Socrates, these forms or universals were immanent. You could discover them by looking at the world.
So by looking at a bunch of horses, you could figure out the definition of horse.
Precisely. But Plato's forms are transcendent. They exist totally independent of the physical world. They're not concepts you derive from observation. They are a separate, unseen reality. That leap from universals in the world to universals beyond the world, that's the mark of Plato.
And the need for that transcendent refuge, that escape into eternal truth, it seems like it was forged in the fire of Athenian political failure. Plato was set up for a life in public service, but a series of Well, traumatic events just completely soured him on the whole thing.
The first hammer blow was Athens losing the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC. That defeat led to this short-lived, incredibly brutal oligarchy, the 30 Tyrants. And Plato had connections. His own relatives, Critias and Charmides, were leading figures in it.
He was even invited to join them, and at first he was maybe a little hopeful, but he recoiled almost immediately. The sources highlight their atrocities, especially the moment they tried to implicate Socrates in the seizure of a man named Leon of Salamis for summary execution.
They ordered Socrates to help with the arrest, basically trying to make him complicit. But Socrates just refused. He went home, risking his own life. That act of brutality and the regime's general lawlessness made Plato see power corrupting his own family. He wanted no part of it.
So oligarchy was a failure. But then the restored democracy didn't fare much better in his eyes. Only a few years later, they brought charges against Socrates, and they executed him in 399 BC.
And that was the final straw. That execution cemented his disillusionment. He watched his teacher, who he called the most just man of his age, be condemned by a jury of his fellow citizens. It proved to Plato that neither the rule of the few nor the rule of the many could provide a just foundation for life.
So he concluded the whole system was sick. It wasn't just about who was in charge. It was a deeper failure to understand what justice and goodness even are.
Right. After Socrates' death, Plato left Athens. And his travels were crucial because he becomes this great intellectual synthesizer. He's absorbing these wildly conflicting ideas from the pre-Socratics.
And he's facing two, completely contradictory worldviews. On one side, he studies with a follower of Heraclitus.
And Heraclitus' whole thing was radical change. Pantarei, everything flows. The world we see is in constant, chaotic flux. You can't step into the same river twice. Nothing holds still.
And then, on the complete opposite side, you have the tradition of Parmenides, who argued that true reality is eternal and absolutely unchanging. Change, motion, all of it. That's just an illusion of our flawed senses. True being is one.
So how do you possibly build a philosophy out of that? Two mutually exclusive starting points. Plato's genius was to say they were both right, but about different realms. He proposes two worlds. The material world we sense, that's the Heraclitean realm of constant change, but the unseen world we grasp with our reason, that's the Parmenidean realm of eternal, unchanging forms. And that's how he gets the stability he needs for true knowledge.
And to give that structure some teeth, he was deeply influenced by the Pythagoreans during his travels to Italy. He studied with mathematicians like Archytas.
The Pythagoreans gave him the toolkit. The sources point to three key impacts. First, the idea that mathematics and abstract thinking are the only secure basis for philosophy. Abstract thought is reliable, our senses are not.
And second, this kind of mystical idea that the physical world is just an imitation of an eternal mathematical reality, the belief that all things are number.
Right. Think about the number three. You can see three chairs, you can see three trees, but the concept of threeness itself isn't physical. It's an eternal, non-perceptible truth. If you can accept that mathematical truths exist independently of the things they describe, you're already halfway to accepting Plato's forms.
That's a great way to put it. And the third major impact.
The practical model for a philosophical life. The Pythagoreans had these tightly organized communities of thinkers, all devoted to intellectual and spiritual improvement. That structure directly led to the establishment of the institution that would secure his legacy, the academy.
He founded it in Athens around 383 BC. It wasn't a university in our sense, but it was the very first institutionalized philosophical school in the Western world. This is where intellectual heavyweights like Aristotle would show up and become his student for 20 years.
The intensity there was legendary, and sometimes it drew a bit of ridicule. There's a wonderful fragment from a comic writer named Epicrates. He lampooned the academy, and he has this scene of students all fiercely debating the proper genus of a pumpkin.
A pumpkin, that's fantastic. You can just picture people laughing at these deadly serious philosophers arguing about the true pumpkinness of a gourd.
It was a perfect piece of satire. It was aimed at Platonic diaresis, or division, this rigorous method of dividing a concept into smaller and smaller categories to find its perfect form. Epicrates was just poking fun at how abstract and removed from practical life it all seemed.
Which is funny, because that contrast brings us right back to politics. Even with the academy flourishing, Plato was repeatedly drawn back to Sicily, to Syracuse, to try to make his political ideals a reality.
He made three famous and, frankly, disastrous trips. The first time, he impressed a man named Dion, the brother-in-law of the tyrant Dionysius I. But Dionysius himself became hostile and basically threw Plato out.
But the real attempts came later. After Dionysius I died, Dion begged Plato to come back and tutor the new young ruler, Dionysius II. The hope was to mold him into the ideal ruler, the Philosopher King. This was a real attempt to put the Republic into practice.
And it was a spectacular failure. Dionysius II was suspicious of his uncle, Dion, and eventually expelled him. The whole experiment just collapsed.
And yet he tried again, a third time. He went back to try and mediate and get Dion reinstated. This time, Dionysius II basically held Plato against his will. It took the intervention of his friend Archytas to get him safely back to Athens.
So you have the greatest political philosopher of the age, the man who designed the perfect state, trying 3 separate times to implement his vision, and failing dramatically every single time. It nearly cost him his life. His greatest success, it seems, was always in the abstract realm of the academy.
Okay, so let's pivot from that turbulent life to the ideas that define him, starting with the big one, the theory of forms. This is his answer to the chaos of the material world.
The forms are Plato's way of establishing certainty. If Socrates' problem was that everyone could give you an example of justice, but nobody could define justice itself, Plato's solution was to say that universal justice exists. Just not here. Not in a world of our senses.
So the world we see, the world of chairs and trees and people, that's all temporary and unstable. They're just imperfect copies. The true reality is the forms, the perfect eternal blueprints of tableness, treeness, humanity that exist in some separate, non-material dimension.
And that separation is absolutely vital. The forms are unchanging objects of our reason. They represent types, properties like beauty or truth, patterns, relations. When you talk about beauty, you're not talking about a beautiful person. You're talking about the singular, perfect form of beauty that causes that person to appear beautiful.
It sounds almost mystical, but it's grounded in logic, isn't it? The idea that if two things share a property, there has to be a single independent thing that explains that property.
Right.
Otherwise, you just get an infinite regress.
Exactly. And to make this concept truly foundational, Plato puts one form at the very, very top of the hierarchy, especially in the Republic, and that's the form of the good.
The form of the good is, well, it's baffling. It exists beyond being. What does that even mean in practical terms?
He uses the famous analogy of the sun to explain it. Just as the sun provides the light that lets our eyes see objects in the physical world, the form of the good provides the intellectual illumination that allows our reason to apprehend the other forms. The sun isn't the things it lights up, but it's the cause of their visibility and even their existence.
So the good is the source of all knowability and all reality, but it's not itself a thing you can know in the same way, because it's the prerequisite for knowing anything at all.
That's the subtlety. It's the ultimate source of intelligence, truth, and order. And the goal of the philosopher, the goal he failed to achieve in Syracuse, is to climb this ladder of understanding, moving past mere opinion until you finally apprehend the good.
It's a beautiful system, but it didn't go unchallenged. I mean, the obvious question is, how does a physical chair participate in the abstract form of tableness? And if forms are eternal, is there a form for everything? Is there a form of mud, a form of hair?
That is a problem that his own student, Aristotle, famously pressed. It leads to what's called the third man argument. If you need a form of man to explain why all men are men, then you also need a third form to explain the similarity between a man and the form of man, and so on, forever. It's a powerful early critique.
Which brings us to the second pillar of Platonism, as you called it, the doctrine of the immortal soul.
Right. For Plato, the soul is much more than just a life giver. It's the center of our personality and the seat of all knowledge. He argues fiercely for its immortality, with dialogues like the Phaedo ending with these elaborate proofs and descriptions of the afterlife.
His key contribution here, though, is giving the soul a structure, the famous tripartite soul. He divides it into 3 parts.
The highest, noblest part is reason, the logistikon, located in the head. It's what calculates, seeks wisdom, and tries to understand the forms. Its virtue is wisdom.
Then below that, you have spirit, the thymoides, in the chest area. This is ambition, honor, anger, the drive to protect. Its virtue is courage.
And finally, the lowest part is appetite, the epithymidikon, located in the gut. This is all our base desires: food, drink, sex, money. Its virtue is temperance or self-control, and a just person is one where this hierarchy is in order, reason rules spirit, and both of them team up to control the unruly appetites.
And this idea of the soul leads directly to one of his most radical ideas about knowledge, anamnesis, or recollection. He basically uses reincarnation to argue that learning is not about discovering new things, but about remembering truths the soul already knew before it was born.
It's a profound claim. It means the most important knowledge is innate, pre-existing, gained from a direct encounter with the forms in some pre-bodily state. The physical world just serves as a trigger for that memory.
And the classic example of this is in the Meno. Socrates calls over an uneducated slave boy who knows no geometry, and he asks him to double the area of a square.
The boy gets it wrong at first, as you'd expect, but then Socrates, just by asking questions and drawing in the dirt, guides the boy to the correct solution.
The crucial point being that Socrates never tells him the answer. He only elicits it. Plato's conclusion is that the boy didn't learn this geometric truth, he recollected it. And since that truth is an eternal, non-perceptible form, it proves the soul must have existed before birth and known these things.
It's a way to completely bypass the messiness of sensory experience and ground knowledge in something stable, reliable, and eternal.
Okay, so this takes us directly into his epistemology, his theory of knowledge. And he asks us to completely reverse our intuition, basically saying, he who sees with his eyes is blind.
Right. The world of the senses is always in flux. If everything is changing, any statement you make about it can only be temporary. So, reality is unavailable to those who rely only on sight or sound.
The best you can get from your senses are mere opinions. They lack necessity, they lack stability.
Whereas true knowledge is gained from the non-sensible, unchanging forms. And this is critical because it gives you foundational knowledge. It gives you a rock to build on so you can avoid that infinite regress of justifications we talked about.
We often credit Plato with the first written definition of knowledge in the Theaetetus as justified true belief, JTB. It's been the starting point for epistemology for 2,000 years.
But what's so fascinating and often overlooked is that Plato immediately criticizes his own definition in that same dialogue.
He tears it apart, doesn't he?
He does. He suggests that for a belief to be truly justified, you'd need to know the difference between that thing and everything else. But knowledge of difference would itself require prior knowledge. So the definition becomes circular. You need knowledge to get justification, which you need to get knowledge. His self-critique is just incredible. The very problem he raised became the basis for the Gettier problem in 1963.
Moving from knowledge to ethics, he uses that same rigorous logic to challenge conventional morality. The best example has to be the Euthyphro dilemma. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is loved by the gods?
It's such a devastating question for any divine command theory of morality. If something is good just because the gods love it, then morality is completely arbitrary. The gods could love cruelty, and that would make it good. But if the gods love it because it is good, then the good must exist independently of them. It's a form that even the gods have to recognize.
And Plato, following Socrates, leans heavily toward that second option. In the Protagoras, he argues that knowledge is virtue, that no one does bad on purpose. Evil is just a form of ignorance. If you truly know the good, you will do the good.
And this all culminates in the blueprint for his political philosophy in the Republic. Justice is achieved when both the individual and the state are internally harmonious.
This is the city-soul analogy. The state is just the individual writ large. Three parts of the soul, reason, spirit, and appetite, are perfectly mirrored in the three classes of his ideal city.
Exactly. At the very top, corresponding to reason, you have the governing class, the rulers, the Philosopher Kings. They have to be rational, highly trained, and in love with wisdom because their decisions must be based on knowledge of the good, not on wealth or power.
Then next, corresponding to spirit, you have the protective class, the guardians, the army. They're strong, brave, and they protect the state. But they have to be controlled by the ruler's reason.
And finally, corresponding to appetite, you have the productive class. The laborers, farmers, merchants, the vast majority of people driven by material desire. But they have to accept the authority of the higher classes for the city to be just.
And justice, for the state, is when each class does its own job and doesn't meddle in the business of the others. The Philosopher Kings rule because they've achieved self-mastery, and so they're fit to govern the state in the same way.
And of course, we should remember the tragic counterpoint. His miserable failures in Syracuse, trying to make a real-life philosopher king out of Dionysius II, the theory proved, let's just say, practically impossible.
The sources also show this really stark, almost deterministic view he had about how states fail. Socrates lays out this rigid progression of decline.
It starts with the ideal, aristocracy, rule by the best. But even that can't last. It declines into timocracy, rule based on honor and ambition. Reason loses control to spirit.
And that obsession with glory and material validation eventually slides into oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy few.
The appetitive part of the soul takes over, specifically the desire for money. The state is literally split between the rich and the poor.
Which is so unstable that it leads to democracy, rule by the people, which Plato sees as being characterized by this excessive, uncontrolled freedom.
Right. To him, it's anarchy. The people reject all authority, and the state becomes chaotic.
And that chaos, he argues, creates a vacuum that allows for the final, worst regime to take hold: tyranny. One man seizes power to restore order, but he's driven by the most lawless appetites and rules only by force and fear.
It's a deeply pessimistic view of history, a one-way slide from wisdom down to pure force.
Before we move on from the philosophy, we have to touch on his complicated relationship with communication itself. Rhetoric, poetry, myth. He seems to both condemn and use them.
He really does. In The Gorgias, he rails against rhetoric. He sees it as just a form of flattery, aimed at what feels good rather than what's true.
But then in the Phaedrus, he's more ambivalent, suggesting a true philosopher could use a kind of higher rhetoric based on knowledge of the forms. It's so complex.
The paradox is even clearer with poetry. Socrates says poetry is inspired by the muses, that it's a form of divine madness. And in the Phaedrus, Plato seems to approve of this divine madness.
But then in the Republic, the same guy wants to ban the great poetry of Homer. He even wants to ban laughter because he's afraid these powerful emotions will corrupt the rational souls of his guardians.
The key, though, is the didactic purpose. He was deeply suspicious of anything that bypassed our reason, but he also understood the power of storytelling.
Which is why he used his own myth so much. The story of Atlantis, the myth of Ur about the afterlife, and of course the allegory of the cave.
Exactly. Those myths were a bridge. He knew only a few people could follow the rigorous philosophical arguments. For everyone else, stories and tales were the way to convey these huge philosophical conclusions about reality and our destiny.
Okay, so that brings us to the final part.
Yeah.
The endurance of his works and his legacy. We've covered the written texts, but we should acknowledge something that was deliberately kept out of them: the unwritten doctrines.
This is a really fascinating area. Ancient sources, especially from within the academy, strongly suggest that Plato had these fundamental metaphysical teachings that he only disclosed orally, probably just to his most trusted fellows.
We know about a famous lecture on the good, where he is believed to have identified the supreme form of the good with the one with unity itself as the fundamental principle of all reality.
In that oral tradition is a crucial legacy connection. Centuries later, it provides the basis for the Neoplatonism of Plotinus. Plotinus builds his whole system on this idea of emanation from the one, showing this direct, continuous path from Plato's esoteric teachings.
Now we have to address the miracle of his legacy, the survival of his works. Unlike almost all of his contemporaries, Plato's complete body of work is believed to have survived for over 2,400 years.
It's genuinely extraordinary to have the entire philosophical output of a major thinker from the 4th century BC it's a gift. And we read them today in an arrangement set up in the 1st century AD by Thrasyllus of Mendes.
And the style, as we said, is so unique. Plato never speaks in his own voice. Some dialogues are purely dramatic. Others have these complex, nested narrative structures.
Scholars group them chronologically by style, though the exact order is always debated. You have the early dialogues, which are very Socratic, often ending in aporia, in doubt or confusion. They ask what justice is, but don't give a final answer.
Then you get the middle dialogues, the philosophical powerhouses like the Republic and the Symposium. This is where he lays out the full theory of forms and the tripartite soul.
And finally, the late dialogues, like the Laws and the Timaeus. They're difficult, they're dense, highly technical. They feel like his final, complex statement to his most dedicated students.
And it's worth noting that his longest work, The Laws, was unfinished when he died. It had to be edited by his student, who also wrote an appendix to it.
Despite the staggering scope of his work, his influence did wane for a bit in the West during the Middle Ages. He was eclipsed by his student, Aristotle. For the scholastics, Aristotle was simply the philosopher. Only the Timaeus was widely known in Latin.
But the flame was kept alive. Study continued in the Byzantine Empire and, crucially, during the Islamic Golden Age.
Neoplatonism became hugely important in Islamic philosophy. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna used it to bridge the gap between a transcendent God and the tangible world. Al-Farabi even proposed his own ideal city based on the Republic.
So Plato's political theory was being preserved and adapted thousands of miles from Athens.
And then it just explodes back into Western Europe during the Renaissance. When Byzantine scholars fled to Italy with Plato's original Greek writings, it sparked an intellectual revolution.
Suddenly, Renaissance scientists and artists had a philosophy based on eternal, unchanging mathematical truths. It was a powerful alternative to the Aristotelianism that had dominated for centuries.
And his framework continues to define modern debates. Albert Einstein said scientists have to be Platonists or Pythagoreans, valuing logical simplicity over just raw data.
And in philosophy, he still sets the rules. Gottlob Frege's work in logic was inspired by him. And as we said, when Edmund Gettier challenged the definition of knowledge in 1963, he adapted examples straight out of Plato's Theaetetus.
So whether you're building logical systems, designing experiments, or just asking what it means to know something, you are, in fact, still working in the house that Plato built. Whitehead's claim really does stand firm.
There's a tremendous amount of ground. So, to briefly summarize, we tracked Plato from his political failures, which pushed him to find stability in the eternal realm of the forms, with the form of the good at the top.
We detailed his revolutionary psychology, the tripartite soul, and how it mirrored his ideal state. We saw the doctrine of an amnesis recollection grounds truth in the soul's prior existence.
And finally, we tracked the improbable survival of his works, preserved by Byzantine and Islamic scholars before powering the Renaissance and still setting the agenda for modern philosophy.
But as we close this out, let's go back to the end of his life and leave you with a final thought. A thought about the tension between his philosophy and his actual practice.
Plato's core philosophy is crystal clear. The eternal, non-material forms are all that really matter. The physical world is just a shadow, a copy, an illusion. And yet, our sources reveal some fascinating details about his will.
The documents confirm that his will details his estate, his material possessions, but it doesn't mention the academy. And scholars think this means he'd already made separate, careful, substantial provisions for its continued existence, probably an endowment or a trust.
So we have the philosopher who dedicated his life to teaching the power of the non-material, spending his final years ensuring the meticulous long-term survival of a very tangible physical institution. A grove, some buildings, a school.
What does that deep foresight, that careful institutional planning for the physical continuation of the academy, tell us about the practical application of his philosophy? Was this just a pragmatic compromise? Or does it suggest that even Plato, at the end, recognized the indispensable role that material institutions play in safeguarding transcendent truths?
What stands out to you about this contrast between the philosopher, the eternal, and the founder of the institutional? Something to think about is you realize you were still walking the path he paved 2,400 years ago.